In this video, I want to turn to the book by Perugini and Gordon, and it's called The Human Right to Dominate. And in this video, I'm going to look at the introduction of this book. Very interesting. It's going to be quite different from Griffin's approach, so it's a good text to read if you want to look at something that is countering sort of Griffin's more philosophical, analytic approach. This one has definitely the view that it's a complicated political story when you're dealing with human rights. It's not simply just a philosophical discussion of the concept of human rights. Nonetheless, they do tell an interesting story of what they think this concept of human rights is. Okay, so let's dig in. Um, they point out that human rights really has no essential core, right? And so can be used and appropriated, spun in various ways. And so that's an interesting thing to think about, that this is a concept that really doesn't have a core to it. People may say it does or whatnot, but when they're talking about it, they're giving that concept content. That's what these guys are more or less arguing. That, yeah, sure, you can say, well, this is the essential content or that is, but you're engaged, you're filling in the content. So it essentially is this concept that it has its content filled in, and so it can be used, appropriated, so that term's going to come up a lot, spun in various ways. In other words, it can suit various agendas. So that's what they're interested in. Now, human rights, are often said to be, violated, of course, by acts of violence. You're violating someone's human right to a personal bodily security, for instance. So violence against a person, or violence against countries, et cetera, et cetera. There's a violation of a kind of human right, or maybe a conglomerate or an aggregate of human rights of security. So it could be violated. But then on the other hand, we say, well, there are certainly some cases where I might preserve my human right to security by defending myself. And if I have to, I may have to use violence to defend myself. So I'm protecting my own human right to security by the use of violence. So violence could play a role in violating human rights, but it could also play a role in preserving them. So they point out that there's lots of different ways that violence and human rights could be related. They want to say that, look, violence is normally associated with some kind of domination. And that's what they're really interested in is, and that's why you get this kind of odd title like the human right to dominate. They think prima facie, at first glance, it seems counterintuitive, and I think it is counterintuitive. But they're trying to say, look, if you dive a little deeper into this, you'll see it's not that counterintuitive after all. Why? Because you have to really explore this link between human rights and domination. And remember, human rights, again, they're saying there's no essential core to them. So they're looking more at, well, what is the meaning of it? Well, as Wittgenstein might say, well, if you want to know what human rights, what that term means, look at how it's used. And that's what they're more or less doing. They're saying, no, don't just think about it. Look at how the term is used. And so that's really the whole book is flowing out of that kind of attitude regarding sort of a semantic notion of what do human rights mean? Well, look at how they're used. Okay, so what's the link between human rights and domination? Well, domination, they say, what's that? Well, they don't really give a formal, what I would think is like a philosophically analytic definition of it. But it's basically a variety of ways to control individuals or states or groups or whatever. And these could be various kinds of relationships of control. And they tend to be characterized when we say they're domination, right? Because you have all kinds of relationships of control that wouldn't necessarily fall under the characterization of force or coercion. So that's what they're looking at. When they say domination, it's a controlling type of relation that's characterized by force and coercion, or one of the two. And probably, if you really get into this, it'd be hard to keep them separate, because those two concepts are also very related. Okay, so the appeal has been to human rights to legitimize these kinds of shall we say, modes or relationships of control. And so the HR discourse, the language, right? The discourse, just kind of a way of speaking, the language of human rights is appropriated, right? We've seen that already. Now, so far, they say, again, you can quibble with this, but they say that largely it's been liberals people kind of, shall we say, center left of the political spectrum. More liberals, that tended to be a liberal kind of style of discussion. Namely, they would talk a lot about human rights discourse. Maybe that you could debate that, but in any case, probably historically, maybe we could accept that. But in any case, they say that, look, what we've noticed, say the authors, is that conservatives, this notion of appropriation of the discourse of human rights is not just the province of liberals anymore. Other people are starting to use it, other groups, right? So conservatives are using it more and more. So some people say, that there's sort of a rights creep, human rights creep. Everything, right, is becoming a human right. And if you look around, it's not hard to find that when people are activists or they're supporting a cause, most people will frame everything in terms of human rights. Whatever a person is fighting for, any kind of right, whatever it seems to be, they seem to label it as some kind of human right. And if you've been watching the Griffin videos, he says, not every right is a human right. And even some rights that are human rights are not always that important. But they're not taking that line. They're taking the line that human rights discourse is large, it's getting larger, and it's a powerful mode of discourse. And I think there's certainly something to be said for that. And so what they're interested, though, is that given that this has sort of this enlargement of the sphere of what people are calling human rights, it's done by various actors, again, different agendas. And so actors who appropriate the human rights discourse, they come from all different camps all over the political spectrum. They have certain shared presuppositions. So you can have a look at the text. They go in and they talk about these kinds of things. They have certain notions like legal language, assignment of blame, collection of evidence, how this is going to work, and how they're going to even the conceptualization of what counts evidence as evidence. So various actors who maybe have very different ends in mind will essentially mirror each other in the way that they go about appropriating the discourse of human rights. So sometimes if you're not sure what the end is and you just listen to someone who's talking about it, you'd say, boy, this could be a conservative, a liberal, or whatever. They're speaking in a very similar manner. That's what the authors find interesting, is that these ways of talking are used by people with very different ends. And then sometimes even the same human right could be pressed into service of different ends. So and they give the example of sometimes people will use things like the language that's in the UDHR, for instance, the traditional family. They will say that's a human right, and they will use that to counter, let's say, pro-gay policy, something like that. And then people will define families in different ways and say, no, that supports that human right to a family supports a pro-gay policy. So and they call these things inversions. So the same human right could be pressed into different ends. But they're basically saying that a lot of these things, the ends may differ, but the means are often very similar. And again, it's the appropriation of HR discourse. Now, I think one might think, okay, well, so what? So some people maybe are using it right. You might be sympathetic, and you might say, well, look, that's actually the province of sort of a liberal way of thinking. And these, people that are on this end of the spectrum, well, they're just stealing it and using it wrong. These guys got it right. These guys got it wrong. Or you might want to say, no, these guys had it wrong in the first place, and it took these guys to come in to finally get it right with human rights discourse. Whatever. But notice, in either of those, that's saying that someone's getting the discourse, the application or the appropriation correct. Someone's doing it correctly and someone's doing it incorrectly. So that dichotomy of correct or incorrect appropriation of human rights discourse, that's something they want to say, no, we're not doing that. It's not clear if they totally reject it. Sometimes they say they do, and sometimes they soften it a bit. But in any case, they're not trying to do that. At least more consistently, they claim that they're trying to stay away from that, so that there's no correct appropriation of human rights discourse. In other words, this appropriation of human rights discourse, no matter who does it, it's always a political kind of translation, right? And it also again there's a little bit of a play in this text here that but they think that the human rights discourse kind of frames all the issues. It sets all kinds of things up, normative values, all kinds of things are set up by the discourse of human rights, and this is always a politicized discourse. It's not one side politicizes it wrong, one side politicizes it correctly, or everybody's politicizing it incorrectly or whatever. No, there's just politicization. It's a kind of an economy of a political economy of terms. And everybody's involved in it. So there's no correct appropriation. It frames issues, right? And it establishes domination, right? So it's basically setting up some kind of, again, some kind of control. Human rights is a language, ultimately, as they seem to be saying, of some kind of control, whether it's a liberal-minded control or a conservative control. It's always a matter of control. And you could see, echoes of Marx and Foucault, and they later on, if you dig more into the introduction in the text, they say, this stuff, Marx talked about this. But yeah, so in the end, this really isn't sort of a neutral philosophical domain of discussion. It's a discussion of power, as Foucault might say, or of some kind of domination or duplication and justification of domination, as Marx would say. All right. And so they're saying, and why is this discourse growing? It works, right? Again, you think about it. When people say, I'm here to fight for human rights. I'm not fighting for civil rights. I'm not fighting for any kind of right. It's a human right. So whatever the issue is, people are going to ultimately say, well, yeah, these kinds of rights are human rights. Right? Pick whatever activist you want. When they're talking about, if they're talking about certain kinds of rights, they always say, and those rights are human rights. Right? So that carries the punch of human rights. And they say it serves an epistemic function. In other words, it's framing things. It establishes all kinds of things. What's wrong, what's right, who, the blameworthy, the innocent, the guilty, all these kinds of things. The normative way that we speak about things can be given this HR discourse formation, and that serves what they say is an epistemic function. It's basically, it's kind of an odd term that they use that, but I think in the end they're just saying that it's framing, it's a political way of framing. And then, of course, if you believe all this stuff, then you believe the framework. That's how you'll see the world, right? That's just that's a human right. And you won't probably dig underneath it and ask about the politics of it. You won't even take it as a framework because you don't see the framework. The framework enables you to see certain things. So keep that in mind when you think about a framework. You don't see the framework, you use the framework to see things, right? You don't see the telescope, you see the image of the telescope, right? And you can always say, well, what is this instrument that I'm using? As a matter of fact, when telescopes came around in the very early days, that's what Cardinal Bellarmine said to Galileo. What am I looking at here? And it's like, this is a kind of an instrument you brought in, and I'm supposed to accept everything that I see through it. I'm not going to do it. All right. So think about that as a political formation, a discourse formation shapes how you actually see things, and you may not see the language itself. All right. So keep that in mind. Now, what they want to say also, and they go over a number of things in this chapter, but so far I think we've got the gist. So then they look at some criticisms that they want to avoid and whatnot, but they want to oppose what they call the hydraulic model of human rights. And again, this is, I think, what a lot of people think human rights are like, and they want to say, careful about this. For instance, what characterizes this hydraulic model? Well, that human rights, the more, going up, more human rights, yay, more human rights. Then you get, yay, more empowerment of the weak, right? Yeah, we got to get more human rights into the game here, and we will empower, we will lift up, right? Human rights are, like on the rising tide, the rising tide of human rights will lift all these boats. Okay, sounds good. And what else? Well, that, of course, what's going to follow? More human rights, more empowerment of the weak, domination will go down. Yeah, the weak will, will rise up, and people they won't be able to be dominated so easily. In other words, it can overturn, it can mitigate the oppressor oppressed, right? It can at least mitigate it. Maybe it can't do everything right away, but at least can soften this a bit where it's not so unequal, right? So the domination can go down. So maybe the power. The power disparity or the power differential can at least be decreased, right? Human rights are a good tool for that, right? And also look at, history as Hegel liked to say, it was a slaughter bench. It's a disaster. History's full of terrible things. Human rights can now help, in some ways, it can right these historical wrongs. People that have been oppressed or whatever, wow, once that human rights comes their way, it can lift them out of that oppression. Maybe it can't do anything for people a long, long time ago because those unfortunate souls have passed on, but we can at least stop these kinds of historical, the vestiges of these kinds of historical wrongs, so we can get rid of those. All right, so we've got a number of issues going on here, and as I said, they reject, again, that anybody's using these terms, that anybody's using HR discourse correctly, and some people are using it incorrectly. And they want to say also this model tends to cover up. Sometimes we say, oh, well, let's get some more human rights in there, and maybe we got to, unfortunately, we got to use a little bit of violence. But sometimes this model can obscure what people are doing. If they're using certain forms of violence or domination to increase the number of HRs, they're creating unintended but fully foreseeable side effects. So they want to look at that, right? So you don't get just to bring in HRs and do anything you want. That's problematic as well. And the model tends to, they say, it tends to obscure that issue. All right. But again, don't be fooled. They say that human rights may seem like a depoliticized talk, but it's shot through. It's always political, and that cannot be simply changed. All right. So the challenge then, as they say, is not to understand, who does it right, who does it wrong, or whatever. The challenge is fundamentally this: how to understand that this is always a political kind of conversation when you're talking about human rights. How does it frame things and maybe it frames it in different ways, and how has it done that, and how does it establish domination? That's the key thing. They're going to look, as they say, that with their fundamental example of this is to look at the Israeli-Palestinian issue and how human rights language has been used in that conflict to establish, kind of people who have human rights, people who maybe don't, and it's been used to create certain forms of domination. And then they say that this human rights-driven way of justification of domination, they say that this also plays out in other countries around the globe. So they have their general kind of theory that they put up. They're going to look at it more to understand this. They're going to look at it in a particular situation, namely the Israeli-Palestinian situation, and then see how that can be generalized around the world. And the rest of the introduction, then I'll leave you to have a look at that. That gets into some more of the chapters, a brief summary of each of the chapters. So that's it for the introduction. See you next video.